I'm not a Guido. What can I tell you?
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Rick Caggiano's with us again. I don't know if you remember last year, he was here at this very same time, May. And he talked to us about John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Lincoln and so forth. Now he's going to talk about this very demure, sweet, quiet lady, Mary Todd Lincoln.
Thank you very much. Thanks for. Before I start, I do want to go around the room since this is a round table. Last time I taught this, did this lecture was at Brookdale Community College, and we had about 30 people in attendance, and it was really interesting to go around and get everybody's thoughts on Mary Todd Lincoln, what they knew about her, what they had heard about her growing up. Because I think if you Todd Lincoln, probably the most misunderstood and vilified first lady that we've ever had in our history, up until the advent of social media, where now everything any first lady does is under a microscope. But up until very recently, if you look at the first ladies we've had, they haven't really made too much of an impact, with the exception of a few. The public has kind of cared less. They were out of the public eye, off to the side. And Mary Todd Lincoln is somebody that very much made herself a presence in the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. And for that, she suffered. I think we all have some misconceptions that we've heard when we were growing up about her. No matter how old you are, no matter when you went to school, we all have learned certain things about Mary Todd Lincoln that probably are not true. And so this lecture here tonight is not just to teach you about her. It's not just to share her biography, but it's to get us to look at it from a more modern way of thinking, what we know now psychologically about people and what it can do to shape who they become. So I just want to go around and just very briefly, if you could just say something you know about Mary Todd Lincoln or something that you have heard about her throughout your life.
I always had I've had the feeling that she was not mentally all there, like she was mentally ill.
Right. She was crazy. That's usually what most people say. She was crazy.
For me, I know she
I think
tried to did some redecorating at the White House.
Decorating at the White House, yes, that is true.
she spent thousands of dollars.
He spent a lot of money, absolutely.
She was a very good cook, especially of desserts.
Yes, she was a good cook. Okay.
She believed in the occult.
She believed in the occult. We're going to talk about that later because I love ghosts and creepy things.
Spent a lot of money.
Yep. Spent a lot of money.
She,
Hello.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I understand that she did suffer migraines, physical and mental health issues, but she also was interested in seances. She tried to, reach her deceased sons.
Yes, she did.
That's whoever.
Yes. It was just like the voice of God coming on the ceiling.
That's right.
Threw me off.
Pretty much covered.
Nothing else that you.
Yeah, I mean,
Her son Robert had her committed.
Yes. So these are all things that are true. Now, when I do this talk, it's usually to people that are not necessarily Civil War buffs or Civil War fanatics. You guys obviously know more than the average person. Hearing that she redecorated the White House, that's a good one. It's not something that would normally come up if I was doing this class, say, to just your average audience. Typically, it's she was crazy. She was fat. She spent a lot of money. She died in poverty. She was, she talked to ghosts. She had seances, which, yes, that part is true. But usually what we know about her, what we learned about her, kind of all hinges on the fact that she was crazy, that she was mentally ill. And you can really look at every single thing.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I see what you're doing here with that. And I would just go back to the crazy thing for a minute. I absolutely think that she was not crazy. And that she fought her way out of an insane asylum. I mean,
Right.
come on. And got out.
Yes.
So I don't think that person's crazy. But go ahead.
Right.
I'm sorry.
But these are the things that we learned. I mean, Mary Todd Lincoln, she's an easy target. She's, the punchline of jokes. It's very easy to make fun of her. It was very easy to go after her, to target her. But when we look at her life and we see a lot of the things that she did all stems from PTSD. Just like a lot of the things that we know about her hinge on the fact that people think she was crazy. I personally do not think she was crazy, like you said. And the whole point of this lecture is to get people to look at it from a different perspective, that we can pretty much trace all of her behavior, every little oddity, every idiosyncrasy she had to PTSD, not just from one moment in her life, but several. From when she was a child, straight on through to her romantic life, into her marriage, into the White House, the assassination of her husband, and then beyond. And it's something that a lot of people don't really realize, because we look at these figures throughout history and we tend to forget that, as much as we've changed is as much as we've stayed the same. And when we look at people and events from many years ago, with the exception of wars, we don't really consider PTSD. We don't consider trauma. I do a lecture on the Titanic, and part of that talk is to get people to think of when that ship sunk, those in the lifeboats watching their loved ones go down on the ship, they would have returned with PTSD and severe trauma and would have had to figure out ways to process that. If you look back at the very early years of Mary Todd Lincoln, nothing about her childhood is really normal. And this is something that's going to keep compounding itself over and over again at almost every single point in her life. She's born to the Todd family. They're very wealthy. Father was a businessman. They owned slaves. She grows up with her mother, her birth mother. She loves her very much. They get along very well, but the birth mother, Betsy, will die when Mary Todd is 6 years old. Mary Todd is one of 6 children. Her father will marry another woman named Betsy and proceed to have 9 more children. So she will grow up in a house with 15 kids, plus a father, plus a stepmother, plus slaves, plus servants. So she's really growing up in a very chaotic home life. And she's pretty much raised by her older sister and a slave. Her stepmother and her never got along. If you want to use the term wicked stepmother, that would probably apply to what she had growing up. And from a very early age, she knew one thing, and that was she did not want to be home. The first chance she would have to get out would be on her way. She did not want to stick around. She loved her sister. She loved her family for the most part, but she could not take being in a house that crammed. As soon as she gets a chance to go to what they called finishing school back then, which is where young ladies went to learn etiquette and proper behavior and how to behave and become wives to hopefully wealthy husbands down the line. They'd become debutantes. She went to Madame Mentel's finishing school, where she would undertake classes that women typically did of the time, which would be French, drama, dance, and literature. There wasn't really a need for you to know much more than that, because you were just going to be a housewife. If your husband was wealthy or a politician, all you needed to do was to be able to throw a party and to host events and talk just enough to be noticed, but not really have much of an opinion. However, Mary Todd, mainly out of her boredom and out of her desire to stay occupied and not want to return home, she will undergo a rigorous curriculum, especially for a female student, with the addition of reading, writing, grammar, math, history, French, geography, science, and religion classes, so that every moment of her time will be occupied in study and work. So she could have excuses to not go home on breaks or on vacation, saying that she had too much work, she needed to stay in school, and it would keep her occupied so she could escape her home life. She becomes fluent in French, to the ability where she could switch back and forth between French and English mid-sentence, which is always, I've always marveled at people that could do that. If you've ever been at somebody's house and they speak Spanish and English, and they're yelling at each other and they're switching back and forth between Spanish and English, which I think is just incredible to be able to do that as someone that just speaks one language. So she's doing that with French and English. She's acting in French plays, and she is developing an ability to do what they called mimicking back then, which we would call impersonations today. She had the uncanny ability to copy exactly how somebody sounded, down to their mannerisms, their expressions, and their voice. And she thought this was funny and that people would laugh at that. But when it came time for her to go on the dating scene, hoping to find a suitor, and she would mimic her beau back to their face, they were very intimidated by that. Like, who is this lady making fun of me? So it wasn't acting, it wasn't fun, it wasn't cute. They were challenged and intimidated by a woman who was as equally intelligent as them, but also had this biting personality that could really throw men off guard in this particular time period. An 1839 description of her says she was of the average height, weighing about 130 pounds. She was rather compactly built, had a well-rounded face, rich dark brown hair, and bluish-gray eyes. In her bearing, she was proud, but handsome and vivacious. She was a good conversationalist, using with equal fluency the French and English languages. Mary will also develop her wit, chance to be funny, to be intelligent, to keep up with world events, because when it came time to hang out with males, she wanted to converse with them at a level that they would not expect. She wanted to be basically a male counterpart, whereas a female would not necessarily comment on politics or anything going on in the world. Mary knew exactly what was going on. And she also, in her letters, according to this description here, when she used a pen, its point was sure to be sharp, and she wrote with wit and ability. She not only had a quick intellect, but an intuitive judgment of men and their motives. Ordinarily, she was affable and even charming in her manners, but when offended or antagonized, she could be very bitter and sarcastic. In her figure and physical proportions, in education, bearing, temperament, and history, in everything, she was the exact reverse of Lincoln. And this is something we're going to see develop as she eventually meets Abraham Lincoln and they get married. I mean, you could argue that if you look at most people to run for president, at least in the 1800s, if there was somebody who never should have become president, given their status in life when they were born, probably be Abraham Lincoln. Born, you know, he was a prairie lawyer, born in a log cabin, came from nowhere, wasn't educated, had no money, somebody that should not have thrived on the political scene as he did. And then you could also argue that if there were two people that would ever be mismatched and never be able to have a lasting marriage where they would lean on each other, which they will, it would be Mary Todd and Abraham. They were the opposite of each other in every regard. As for her being out on her own, she is ahead of her time from the very beginning. She is politically savvy, she's socially savvy, she's intelligent, and more importantly, she doesn't care. She will speak her mind. She doesn't care what people think, at least not right now at this point in her life. And it is probably because of this drive and her personality type that she starts to get targeted when she becomes the first lady, that she becomes vilified. Because here was this woman, and obviously, I can't even say male dominated. It was just men. It wasn't like there was a few women sprinkled here and there. It is a male workforce politics. And here is a woman who is articulating her opinion and swaying what her husband is going to do in the White House. So right off the bat, people are taking note of that, especially the newspapers and fellow politicians, which is going to shape the way she has been viewed, was viewed in the present, and currently is viewed now. One of the other misconceptions we have of her is that she was short and that she was kind of homely, but she would have been seen as, quote, the belle of Springfield. She was what everybody wanted to date until they met her and they had to talk to her. You know, by physical appearance, they wanted to be with Mary Todd. And then they heard her start to talk and open her mouth, and they went, wow, this is a lot to handle here. I'm going to pass on that. She had long eyelashes, very beautiful, clear blue eyes. She always dressed nicely. She came from a very wealthy family. But she has also this longing to see her father, because throughout the early portion of her life, all she's been doing is try to avoid being home. She does not want to go back to that environment to avoid the stepmother, but she still does love her father deeply. They will exchange letters back and forth. They will have some visits. But her life is going to begin to change forever, where she will meet Abraham Lincoln, a young prairie lawyer, nondescript, somebody that probably had no potential whatsoever in life to do anything. In 1837, they will meet each other. And despite being from two totally different worlds, they will connect and they will establish probably one of the most important political partnerships between a husband and wife. Mary Todd sees something in him. Maybe not right away, but eventually. Mary Todd, at this point, her desire is to end up with somebody that's going to be in a position of political power. Maybe not the president, but definitely a politician, maybe a governor. And when she meets Abraham Lincoln, she just sees something. There's something about this guy. And while Mary Todd would eventually end up being disliked by so many, Abraham is somebody that people generally liked. If they didn't agree with his politics, that was one thing. But as a person, he's a guy you'd want to have a beer with, so to speak. Mary Todd was somebody, on the other hand, that people did not necessarily want to deal with. And so she meets this prairie lawyer. And while she is on the shorter side, Abraham Lincoln is, of course, 6'4", very large, has a lanky frame. Of course, as you probably know, that in the 1800s, if you were 6'4", you might as well have been 8 feet tall. You would have towered over everybody. He was awkward, clumsy, his voice very high-pitched and backwoodsy. He sounded like a hick. He sounded like somebody that just, was this country bumpkin. And people didn't really know what to expect when they heard him talk, because he would say things and they would think, well, was that smart what he just said or stupid? We can't really figure it out yet. Meanwhile, on the other hand, with her, she was so intelligent and well-spoken, fluent in multiple languages, very much into self-preservation and her appearance, and being seen as a polite young lady. But Mr. Lincoln, on the other hand, was the opposite. He told bawdy jokes. I think I told some of them last year. He liked to tell dirty jokes laced with profanity. He had no ideas of how to act in social company. If he was at a party or a dinner, he didn't know what fork is for the salad and what spoon is for this. She was there to kind of help him and coach him and say, okay, when we go to the gala tonight, make sure you have matching socks on. Make sure the jacket doesn't have holes in it. Don't tell poop jokes when dinner arrives. Just little things like that, trying to establish his social grace, of which he had absolutely none. So, she's helping him and coaching him, and he also has somebody that he can lean on. That's a little bit down the line, but I just wanted to get that out of the way there. So she makes a social impact immediately as this Belle of Springfield. She is very much available. She is also courted by Stephen Douglas as well. The men are swooning over her, but they're intimidated, all but one. Abraham Lincoln wasn't intimidated. He was somebody that, despite that country bumpkin mindset, despite being a man of relatively few words compared to her, he didn't really seem to mind her strong personality. And in this friendship will eventually turn to an engagement. Her family, obviously, you can gather, did not find him suitable, coming from a family that not quite millionaire level, but very wealthy. And they're basically looking at her and you're like, of all the men you could have chosen, you end up with this guy. His family, on the other hand, I don't really know. I couldn't find, much of a reaction from them. They were probably like, wow, good for you. But her, not so much. They still have an argument, though, and they will split for about 1.5 years, which Abraham Lincoln will call the worst time in his life. And Lincoln had several failed romances himself. He was starting to wonder whether or not marriage was even for him, or if he should even bother trying to court women and just give up altogether and go into his, envelop himself in his law practice or get into politics and just leave women on the side. But when Mary Todd breaks up with him, he really is upset and he is depressed and he wants to be with her again. when they get reunited. And you can see the side-by-side comparison. Nothing about the two of them matches. He's tall and lanky. She's short and round. He has no money. She's wealthy. He had 1 year of formal education. She had a full education, as you know. No fashion sense for him. She had too much fashion sense. As some of you mentioned, she liked to spend money. And he was generally well-liked, and she was disliked by many. But what makes them a match is at this point in their life, he is starting to get the feel for politics and sees, again, maybe not ending up in the White House, but going and having a political career. He needs somebody like her in his life that he can lean on and ask questions and get help from. And she wants somebody that is going to at least be on a trajectory for someone that's going to become powerful. Their marriage is interesting. November 4th, 1842. 1 day's notice she gives to her family. So on November 3rd, she said, guys, we're getting married tomorrow. And 30 people were invited. That's all they could manage to get to the house. They get married right at the home in a simple ceremony. And the reason is not exactly known, but it has been speculated by historians, and I guess this is as good a reason as any, is that somewhere right before November 3rd, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd had sex for the first time. That was Abraham's very first time, and he freaked out and said, we got to get married right now. And for her, that was probably all she wanted to hear. Oh my God, yes, let's do it. We're going to get married tomorrow. And this is literally how the wedding transpires. Mary Todd's sister said even a free Negro would give her family enough time to bake a cake. This was as shotgun of a wedding as you could ever have. And while standing there at the, I guess you could say, the altar in their home with the priest, it was described by many in attendance that he looked terrified, including one who said he looked like he was going to the slaughter. That even though it was his idea, he was still absolutely frightened to be taking part in this. Because like I said, he didn't know, is marriage for me? I don't know. And now all of this is happening really quickly, going from 0 to 60. But they are married. And these are the two. This is not precisely what they look like at the time of the marriage, but this is as close to that year as I could find for the both of them. And you can see two people who look, I would say, very different from the image that we're used to seeing. Of course, Abraham, usually we see him when he's a little older. He's got the beard. Mary Todd, we love to show pictures of her when she's older and wearing her mourning dresses and looking like she's crazy, which was, why those pictures were circulated so frequently, to try to prove that, look at her, she's unhinged the way she is dressed. But these are very different images here. You can see in him, Honest Abe. I mean, you look at that picture and, I'd vote for that guy. And then you have Mary Todd, who, you can read whatever you want into these pictures, but she just looks like she's young and she's full of hope, and they got their whole lives ahead of them. Their early married life, they're going to live in a $10 a week room above a tavern. Her father wanted to give her money so that they could live somewhere nicer, but they were determined to make it on their own, even though Abraham will accept from him the gift of lucrative legal cases, so that he still is getting help. He's making money, but it will give him a chance to earn that money himself. The father will visit her, showers her with gifts, clothing, jewelry, etc., and will help them eventually buy a larger cottage, where they will give birth to Robert later that year in 1843. And it was said she, quote, fell off the earth after becoming a mother, because she did not want to be what her stepmother was. She wanted the children to have a nice life. She was described as superb and doting. She dropped all of her social occasions and social commitments. She threw the best parties in the town, but she stopped all of that to focus on Robert and eventually Edward, who was born in 1846. It was said by people who visited their home that the children were given way too much freedom. She just let them run around yelling, screaming, playing, acting crazy. And at this point, neither her or Abraham believed in physical discipline because she had received that from her stepmother, and of course that hatred of the stepmother. So we're seeing now an early trauma manifesting itself, although in a positive way for the moment. You know, people that are abused as children, usually you go one of two ways. You either repeat the trauma you had, or you try to veer in the total opposite direction and try to break that chain of violence. She will, however, suffer from severe anxiety. She has trouble sleeping and severe nightmares when Abraham is away, which he will be frequently now that he's getting these legal cases. And then once he gets into politics, and she really can't grapple with being alone. I mean, she really needs him there. She doesn't really confide in him, this fear, at least not right away. But she will get back on the entertaining scene, partly because she's tired of being lonely. You know, the children are, you know, they're not babies anymore. They're starting to grow up. So she wants to start having parties again. She will employ two women, one Elizabeth Keckley, who she will remain friends with until right after the assassination, when something will change that friendship. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Mary, despite having a decent money to be able to hire a cook, to hire, you know, a butler or a maid, she likes to cook and clean herself. As somebody mentioned, she was a good cook. And all she wanted to do was cook these feasts for Abraham Lincoln. But guess what? Mr. Lincoln was not a big eater. He was just somebody that could eat an apple for dinner and just be totally fine with that. And in fact, his favorite food was actually a kind of a pancake, but made with cornmeal. You could call it a hoe cake. So all of the things, the gourmet food knowledge that she probably has from taking all those French classes, she really can't bestow any of that on her husband. And he sometimes forgets to eat altogether. She has to go into his office and say, hey, you haven't had dinner yet. He'll get up and he goes and gets an apple or a piece of bread with butter and then goes right back into the office. So it's a little bit disappointing for her. By the mid-1850s, he is going to see his law practice take off. He gets involved in politics, the House of Representatives, and this will leave her alone more days and nights than she was originally, and she will start to suffer from migraines. Again, partly because the children are running around rampant, in addition to the stress and the trauma that she is going to, and she will actually sell some of her own land in order to pay for a second floor on their house so that she might have a place to go and escape to, so the children can run around, do whatever they want downstairs, but she can go up to the second floor and get a little bit of quiet. She does write to a friend, I hope you may never feel as lonely as I sometimes do. And this is where the opposites of her and her husband really begin to manifest even more. When she is stressed and upset, she wants somebody that's going to give her a hug and hold her and say everything's going to be okay. Abraham, when he's upset and stressed, he wants to just be left alone. And I mean, this probably sounds like people we know, maybe family, maybe a husband or wife. People are different. Some people want that attention. Other people like, just give me an hour, leave me alone, and I'll be fine. But the two of them, had they both been of the same type, both wanting affection, certainly would have been a little bit better for her. As for her views on slavery, if you look through, her writing, which I haven't examined every single thing she's ever written, but I definitely did enough of a search, I think, to not find her really say anything for or against it. Obviously, her husband is going to end up on a path towards being against slavery, even though in his early political career he really wasn't. Her family has slaves, and although she has the money to buy slaves, she chooses to hire somebody as a worker, not as a slave. So despite being very politically savvy and never afraid to interject her opinion into anything, she really does not come across as somebody totally interested in slavery. Maybe intentionally, because she knew this was the hot button issue of the time and she wanted to stay out of it, or maybe because she just genuinely didn't feel any particular way. After the war, though, She will make donations to what was called the Contraband Relief Association, which helped newly freed slaves kind of make their way in life, one of the many programs of Reconstruction. She will write letters on behalf of Black individuals who are seeking government jobs, and she will call the Emancipation Proclamation in 1866, quote, a precious legacy for my sons. Now, if you think back to last year, which a lot has happened in the last year, but part of my Lincoln talk is the Back to Africa movement, which she supported along with him, which was a semi-successful movement to relocate newly freed slaves in Liberia and Western Africa. The thought being that they'll never experience true equality here because there's too much discrimination, so why not give them their own colony on the continent from which they came from, which early on and on paper sounded like a great idea, but after a few years, it started to lose interest even in the abolitionists who were for it originally, and many of the newly freed slaves feeling that although their descendants, their ancestors came over from Africa as slaves, they were born in this country and therefore did not want to go back to Africa. But I just throw that in there because it's something that not many people know about, but it was certainly a large enough movement involving the likes of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. She will begin to struggle with depression, as will Abraham, which is what they called the melancholy back then. Both of them were absolutely manic depressive, almost relentlessly so by the time they get into the White House for various reasons that we're going to discuss. Like I said earlier, she wants attention, he wants distance. This makes her migraine even worse. By the time she gets into the White House, she is still refusing to conform. And even though she didn't really care too much about what people thought of her early on, by the time she's in the White House, you know, now it's not just gossip talking about, oh, well, look at Mary Todd. Now it's newspaper articles about you. And, you know, thousands, millions of people reading stories about, oh, look at the money she spent on that dress. Did she really have to spend $5,000 to put new wallpaper in this room in the White House? And that actually does start to get to her, even though early on she really didn't care. They will all go to Washington, though. Usually politicians back then, if you were in Congress or House of Representatives, usually you went to Washington, but your family stayed wherever it is that you were from. It was out of the ordinary for a wife and children to accompany their husband to Washington, but she is there to help him and coach him. People are taking note of this, but this is pre-White House, so it's more of a curiosity. It's not really a hatred of her. It's just like, oh, wow, look, Mary Todd's going with her husband. That's interesting. She will write letters for his campaign, which people also took note of and again said, that's interesting. Cool. But 1849 and 1850 back to back, she is going to suffer two tragedies. One, her father, whom she loved dearly, will pass away in the very next year, loses her son, Edward. So we have this person that came from a very rough childhood, was striving to be the greatest mother she could be. One of the only family members that she really held dear was her father, and then one of her children will pass away in such close proximity. This is like a double whammy to her, but in terms of trauma, it seems that she tries to just get right back into the swing of things, trying to put this behind her and move on. She will give birth to William just 9 months after the death of Edward, and then 3 years later gives birth to Tad. 5 years after that, Abraham Lincoln's career will be jump-started when he gets into a congressional election with Stephen Douglas, who, like I said earlier, did court Mary Todd. He will lose that election, but it helps to elevate him to a level of national notoriety. Lost the battle, but will win the war, so to speak. And he starts to now feel that he should run for president, that he has been given enough stardom by this election that he should go for it. And Mary is super excited about this. She's in her element. This is what she's been waiting for. You know, my husband's going to run for president of the United States. What can I do to help him? And the answer to that is everything. Telling him how to dress, how to act, what dinners to go to, who to talk to, what interviews to give. writing letters, and the press are taking note. Again, it's not negative attention yet, but they are taking note that, in this era that, this woman is kind of with him, wherever he goes, and is kind of steering his election. And he will win the Republican nomination. And viewing her as an equal partner, actually says when he hears that he was nominated, he will say to Mary, Mary, we are elected, kind of giving her the credit with him that, you and I did this together. After he becomes president, and really for their entire lives together, they are never photographed together. And she refused this. She allowed them to be depicted in drawings or paintings together, but she did not want to be in a photograph, because if they were side by side, it would show just how much taller he was, or in her mind, how much shorter she was. And so drawings were okay. As you can see here, they're almost the same height. So that was okay with her, even though for the time, she wasn't really that short by 1860 standards, but he was, a mammoth-sized human, and so she did not want the public to see the height discrepancy. Her family, though, and this is something that's going to not only plague her throughout the Civil War years, but something that will also be used as fodder by the press, is her family, and that she is literally an example of the house divided that we hear so often about families that are split between pro-Union or pro-Confederate. One brother goes north, one brother goes south. She will have stepbrothers that end up fighting for the Confederacy. And this is something that she's never able to shake. And even though she does love the stepbrothers, she's married to president of the Union while having brothers fighting for the enemy. And trying to grapple with that dynamic. When she does arrive in the White House, though, she's actually pretty popular. I guess they gave her that honeymoon period that, all presidents usually, you get the first 90 days where they're supposed to leave you alone, and whatever you do is whatever, but after that 90 days, then we're going to come for you. So early on, she's popular. They call her Mrs. Abe. Crowds expect to see her when he's giving a speech. They expect she'll be somewhere off to the side or somewhere in the crowd. But when she arrives in the White House, her first couple of actions are going to be to assemble her wardrobe. She needs to look nice since she's going to be visible and she's going to be with him at all these events. She also needs to remodel the White House. She said, this place is disgusting. It's a pigsty. No, it's literally a pigsty. There is livestock and animals in the White House. You could ride your horse into the White House, and you think the horse is going to wait to do what it's got to do if it's in the White House? No, it's going to go right there. So the place stinks. It's disgusting. It's falling apart. Wallpaper's peeling. The carpet is disgusting. The furniture's falling apart. And she says, there is no way we are living here, or no way I am living here with you. So she is given $20,000 to remodel the White House. She says, oh, wow, great, 20 grand. That was for 4 years. That was for the whole. She spends it all in about 2 weeks. Goes on a shopping trip, New York and Philadelphia. She buys, again, wallpaper, carpeting, artwork, furniture. The home of the president should look a little nicer. And it's not just for them. It'll also be a legacy for the presidents to come after them. And she will continue to spend money beyond this stipend. And Abraham has to warn her and basically says, if you don't stop spending, then I am going to have to pay your debts. It's going to be our money. And she did not want that. So that was able to get her to curtail the spending a little bit. This is one of her dresses on display at a museum somewhere. I can't recall offhand, but this is not a particularly important image. But, so often when we see the black and white pictures over and over again, we sometimes forget that people, they didn't live in black and white. They lived in color. And that's why when I see colorized pictures of Abraham Lincoln, say, the famous last portrait of him that was taken, that picture, he was actually wearing a brown jacket, not a black jacket, as it would appear, because it was black and white. And when you see pictures of Mary Todd, we're always assuming, wow, dark, brooding colors. But she had purple, she had turquoise, she had green dresses, bright and fashionable. So again, not particularly important, but just that reminder that people really did live back then. It wasn't just a static history book. She is shrewd and fearless, and despite one of the things we know about her is she loved to spend money. It came up here with a couple of you, and no doubt will always be one of the things people say they knew about her. She's good for saving money too. Yeah, she can spend, but she can spend when the money's not hers. When it comes to her own money, she's pretty good at putting that aside. Abraham Lincoln's salary was approximately $25,000 a year, which would have earned him $100,000 in his first term. She manages to save about $70,000 of that, which builds a nice little nest egg for her. And one of the other things we always hear about her is her dying in poverty. Well, that was not true, but we're going to get to that later on. She's somebody putting herself in the fray, visiting hospitals to care for soldiers. She's not afraid of blood or amputations. If there's a surgery, she doesn't mind standing right there, holding the soldier's hand, handing the surgeon his tools, blood spattering everywhere. You know, something for a lady of high society. Obviously, one, you would never be expected to be in that situation, but two, they would expect you to just faint dead away at somebody getting their leg amputated. She was not afraid of that. She used her platform to raise money for hospitals. When one of the hospitals ran out of liquor, because that's all they gave you back then, they cut your leg off and said, here, drink some whiskey. She sent the White House liquor stash to the hospitals. And she had this relentless drive to help and to be seen and to try to use her celebrity, you could call it, her personality for good. But do the press really write articles about, wow, look at the first lady helping out with a surgery. Look at the first lady raising money. No. In fact, they look at her spending. Look, there she goes buying another dress. There she goes putting up another layer of wallpaper or paint. They ignore her charity work in favor of things that are a little bit more salacious and gossipy. And they will certainly use the fact that she has the three half-brothers fighting for the Confederacy, that anytime she does something wrong, or what they perceive as wrong, they'll say, yeah, she spent all this money and she's got three brothers fighting for the Confederacy. No matter what they said about her, it was always followed up with, and she's got those brothers there. She will continue to host parties during the war, which will cause controversy, lavish parties that she was known for back in Springfield and became the talk of the town. The press, of course, ate that up. Look at this person having a party and celebrating. You know, 10,000 people just died at Antietam, or 20,000 people just got wounded. All these people are dying and she's having parties. And in her mind, it was, we need a break from the relentless horror of war. We should do something fun. But the press looked at that and said, she's aloof. She's not, she's out of touch. We're having a war and she's having a party. Needless to say, these parties weren't just her in a room by herself. There would have been many people in attendance at those parties, but the blame fell to her. Two of her half-brothers would be killed between 1862 and 1863, and then her second son, Willie, will also pass away in 1862. This is a recurring theme, I guess you could say, in her life, that she has a tragedy, and then a few years go by, and it ends up things looking like they're going to be okay, and then she has a tragedy. And it's like as soon as she's, I hate to say getting over, because we never get over the loss of a loved one, but for lack of a better term, we'll say just as soon as she's starting to get over it, she's hit with another tragedy. And this persists throughout her entire life. Willie, when he dies in 1862, she just cannot cope with it. Unlike the last son who died, she just kind of went into, tunnel vision and persisted. But with this, she has to stay in bed. She can't walk, she can't talk, and she starts to grow distant from Abraham when originally she would have wanted the attention from him. But now she is starting to become like him. She wants the distance. And he is, even if he wanted to, he probably couldn't give her the affection that she needed because he's, running a country He's managing a war, the greatest catastrophe in American history. You know, hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Letters are coming in every day. He's writing letters to families, personal letters, you know, when they lose somebody in battle. And so he's unable to cope with what he is going through. And this distance is going to last about 2 years. They really don't see each other much. They communicate several times a day, either by sending a White House staff member. You know, she would say, check on him, make sure he's wearing his gloves, it's cold out, make sure he's got his hat and scarf on. He would call her mother, go check on mother, see how she's doing, or they'd write little notes back and forth to each other. But as for physical affection and closeness, it's going to be about 2 years where they do not have this. She is going to worry about his health, though. And this is something I'm sure we've read in books and seen in the movies. She's obsessed with his health, making sure he's got proper clothing on so he doesn't catch a cold, which, of course, in the 1860s, you could die from a cold. So those worries are not unwarranted. But it becomes almost an obsessive desire to control what he's wearing because she doesn't want him to get sick. And again, that's something that's PTSD manifest. That's trauma. When somebody dies, it can manifest in many different ways. And sometimes that is becoming obsessed with something. She is becoming obsessed with that. When she finally does kind of come out of it in 1864 in public, she will have a tantrum where she yells and screams at him in public, which is something that people didn't argue in public back then, and especially not people of this stature. Just a couple of pictures here of her with the children. And this is such a rare photograph in the sense that she's got a little smile. I was almost wondering if this was real and not a fake, but to the best of my abilities, it seemed that it was real. This tiny little smile, which people, again, did not smile back then. So this is before, obviously, the death of that second child. Their home life was a little rocky, more so in the beginning, not necessarily in the White House, because by that time they were a little more sedate just because they have so much misery going on. There's a book, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, where the author recounts this moment where, quote, Mary smacked Lincoln in the face with a piece of wood after he failed to build a fire quickly enough to please her. The next day he came to work with a plaster covering his injured nose. Other accounts have her throwing coffee in Lincoln's face, striking him with a broomstick, driving him from the house, and pelting him with books and potatoes. Mary's temper tantrums were the talk of the neighborhood, and she also aimed her tirades at tradespeople and servants. I don't know about you, but the thought of somebody throwing a potato at Abraham Lincoln just puts a little smile. It's just, I don't know. I just think that's amusing. But, their home life is rocky, and it's going to continue to be, not so physically like that in the White House, but these two people can't catch a break. I mean, they really have no happiness whatsoever. And how could they? They've lost 2 children. They got the war going on. How much can any one person take or any couple take? And Abraham Lincoln said this in response to Mary's behavior, very simply, and you can really see him saying this and picture him saying this. Mrs. Lincoln is like no human being I ever saw. She is not easy to get along with, though I succeed pretty well with her. That's all he had to say. She had a tantrum or this happened or that happened. He would not publicly say anything bad about her. All he would say was, she's a little difficult, and then move on. There is, however, another famous interaction in 1864 where a soldier was arrested, charged with desertion, and they were going to execute him because he had deserted his post in order to marry his sweetheart. And Abraham Lincoln found out about this and pardons him with the explanation given, I want to punish the young man. Probably in less than a year, he will wish I had withheld the pardon. So he'll be married. That'll be bad enough for him. But it's just funny, Mary, she has a tantrum and he's just like, oh, whatever, it'll be fine. She just calmly moves right along. Now, a couple people have mentioned the spiritualism aspect, the occult. Now, I love this stuff. I love haunted and creepy things, and so researching Mary Todd and all of this, it's something real interest to me. And I wish this section would be longer, but we would be here all night. There is going to be a movement in the United States, really stemming from England at this time period, where it's called the spiritualist movement, the belief in psychics and mediums and the ability to communicate with the dead via Ouija board or seance or something along those lines. And she was an ardent believer in this from the very moment she heard that this movement existed, partly because she had lost 2 children, her father, all these family members had died. And so she sees this as a way to possibly communicate with these people who she loves so much that were no longer with us. She had very vivid dreams, which she attributed to the spirit world trying to communicate with her. Abraham had visions too, but he didn't really put much stock in them until he would tell her about them, and then she would offer an explanation as to what they mean. In the White House Red Room, she would have seances, typical setting, seated around a table, you have a psychic. While I believe in the paranormal, the spiritualist movement has basically been debunked as people that were literally using the knuckles in their toes to make knocking noises. And you have somebody in another room banging on the wall or making scratching noises. There were all kinds of ways which you could dupe people back then. More so back then because there was no technology and the knowledge that we have now. But nevertheless, this was her way trying to get in touch with her children. And Abraham attended these seances too, maybe not taking part, but still seated in the room. And the press looked at these in 2 very different ways. They looked at Abraham and said, "Wow, he's a good-natured skeptic," is what one article called him, because he was observing but not taking part, as if he was trying to reserve judgment. And then they looked at her, holding hands with the psychic and trying to stir up all this spiritual activity. She was the crazy one, but he was okay. And she will actually say, Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of the bed with the same sweet, adorable smile that he always has had. He does not always come alone. Little Eddie is sometimes with him. And again, thinking back to trauma, this is somebody that if had this all happened today, she would be medicated. She would be on an antidepressant. She would be in therapy. And who knows, she might have been able to break out of the behavior and the depression. People did not totally understand this back then. I mean, even soldiers coming back from war, it was, "What's wrong with you? Get a grip." It was called shell shock as a way to further distance ourselves from the human element of what these people were suffering through. And so she, by going through one loss after another, did she really see the ghost of her son standing at the foot of the bed? I believe in ghosts. It's possible, but more likely it was probably a trauma-induced hallucination or her just wanting to see that son there in the room with her. Things start to look like they're going to get a little bit better. And that's whenever that happens in her life, that's usually means something's going to go wrong soon after. Robert E. Lee's going to surrender on April 9th. And this was not, as you I'm sure all know, is not the end of the Civil War, but it was regarded by many as the symbolic end because Lee was all everybody cared about. We still had some other generals had to surrender, but Washington is having a party. People are shooting fireworks in the streets. For all intents and purposes, the war is over. And 5 days later, they are going to attend the play at Ford's Theater, which is not important just because it's where the assassination is, but it's important of what happens earlier that afternoon. After 2 years of distance, Mary Todd is starting to break out of that a little bit. Partly because of the seances are helping her. That was probably her therapy back then, when you think about it. And she goes on a carriage ride with him, and they hold hands. They have a lovely chat, and they talk about what they're going to do after his presidency. He had just won re-election, so they're looking at 4 more years. and they're looking into the future. What are we going to do when your second term is up? And he wants to see California. He says, I'm president of a state I've never seen before. I want to go to the West Coast. She wants to go on a shopping trip across Europe, which will probably surprise nobody. But they're holding hands and they're laughing and giggling and they're re-falling in love with each other again. Even at the play later that night, they are holding hands. And, you know, when you look at what they've all gone through, and I showed this in the Lincoln lecture, so this is a repeat. I don't have the time lapse with her because there aren't as many images, but these are two people that have been through literal hell. I mean, they have aged themselves probably 20 or 30 years in 5 years. The war, presidency, which is stressful without a war, 2 children dying, brothers dying, father dying, all of this really within 10 or 15 years. It's a lot. And you see how much Lincoln ages here in just less than 6 years. These are two people that, you know, not to interject too much opinion here, they deserved finally a chance to be happy. They deserved for that war to be over and to go to this little play, a comedy on Good Friday, which the press also said, look at them, they're going to a comedy on a holy day. God forbid, right? Like they deserved this little moment. And within a few hours of this carriage ride, you all know what's going to happen. John Wilkes Booth is going to assassinate him. So she will now add a husband to the ongoing list of tragedies. Sitting next to him, her gown spattered with his blood. You know, she's cradling his head in her arms. They move him across the street to where the room and the bed were so small, they had to lay him across it diagonally because he wouldn't fit. For 9 hours, she is, you know, holding on to him in this bed, you know, screaming, crying, saying things. It should have been me. You know, she would have rather died than gone through this again. And it's not just a figure of speech. She probably would have preferred that rather than live through this again. And after clinging to him for 9 hours, they finally have to remove her from the room. They say, you know, you have to like lay down or something. And they will remove her. And just as soon as she is removed from the room, she will faint. And as she faints, he passes away. So she was not there with him when this happens, and she has to be brought back in to see him. Now, this moment here, he is finally going to be at peace, obviously prematurely, and it is remarked by 3 separate people who were in the room. I've chosen to go with the quote from the assistant treasurer of the United States, but if you look at the eyewitness accounts of when Lincoln finally passes away, there's 3 people that all write almost the same sentence word for word. And that was, it was the first time in 4 years probably that a peaceful expression crossed his face. He was finally, he ran his race and he is done. But now Mary Todd has to go on living. And she doesn't really want to because she's seeing it now as my life's over. And she says exactly that. I go hence brokenhearted with every hope in life, almost crushed. Alas, all is over with me. And, you know, if she thinks she's going to lean on her son, Robert, we all know how that's going to end up in a few years from this moment. She cannot attend the funeral because she is so distraught. She's in bed for a month. Andrew Johnson will allow her to stay in the White House as long as she needs to recover, probably the best thing he did in his presidency. And during this month where she is almost in a catatonic state, staff are going to steal things. They're going to loot. Oh, that's Abraham Lincoln's pen. I'm going to take that. Oh, Lincoln drank out of this coffee cup. I'm going to take that. Even back then, these people had the foresight that this stuff is memorabilia and will eventually be worth something. Just as they did, fun fact, with Napoleon Bonaparte, they cut up his bloody autopsy sheets and they sold them in the streets. But not to digress too much. But anyway, Lincoln, he will leave an estate of about $80,000. Remember, she saved about $70,000 of that, and there was a little bit of money from before their presidency. So she's going to spend the rest of her life fearing poverty, and she's going to bounce from place to place, as you're going to see here. But in reality, she has quite a bit of money. She's going to receive condolences from around the world. There's a momentary break where people will leave her alone and say some nice things to her and about her. And if there was one person who could relate to her, it would be Queen Victoria, who lost her husband and stayed in mourning for 40 years, wore that black mourning dress. But she wasn't seen as crazy, even though Mary Todd's going to stay in mourning too. And Mary Todd will respond to a letter from Queen Victoria. I have received the letter which your majesty has had the kindness to write. I am deeply grateful for this expression of tender sympathy, coming as they do from a heart from which its own knows its own sorrow, can appreciate the intense grief I now endure. But it did not take long for the condolences to turn into more shots. William Herndon will publicly say that Mary Todd was not the love of Lincoln's life, and they described their marriage as domestic hell. And then Elizabeth Keckley, her good friend, her dressmaker, will write a tell-all book, Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, which will detail Mary Todd, her eccentric behavior, the tantrums, the melancholy, which, again, today we understand that's depression. Back then, they would have said, "What's wrong with you?" So this book will kind of be explosive in the sense that all of the stuff that she thought was going to stay private, especially since her husband got assassinated, is now out for the world to see. The images, she will have some portraits taken. This is Mary Todd here, and this is Queen Elizabeth. So, I mean, at first glance, if you're not looking and examining these pictures, you might not even really be able to tell the difference. But they're going through the same exact thing. Yet she's revered and respectful, and she's crazy. Why is that? And it's not a question we can really answer, but it's just something to consider, the different opinions of her and why people felt the way they did. Life will go on, though. She will live with Robert and Tad in Chicago, where she becomes a recluse, which is, one of the first things people do when they're suffering severe trauma is they pull themselves out of society. She has quite a bit of debt that she has accumulated because she has spent money that is not necessarily hers, and she has bought things on credit. And what she will do is, rather than just, play the victim, she actually sells the items and pays the debts off. And the press had attacked her all those years for buying this stuff. And now she's selling the stuff to be a good person and pay her debts. And they're saying, look at her. She's selling off all her belongings. Like, there's nothing this woman can do that anybody will say, wow, you know what, look at her. Look, she's doing the right thing. She does pay off all of her debt. She sells enough of her belongings. She's now, scot-free out of debt, and she will start to move again. She travels to Europe. She goes to Germany for 2 years, probably just running away. That's what I call it, running away from her thoughts. And Robert starts to become a vocal critic of her. Maybe nothing too extreme early on, but he starts to say, yeah, my mom is acting a little funny. She's doing all this traveling. She buys a bunch of stuff and she sells a bunch of stuff. She's got 5 of these. She doesn't need this. And, hoarder mentality. You've seen the show Hoarders, right? Usually starts, somebody dies, and they don't know how to respond. They become a hoarder, or you become a recluse. And this is what is happening with her. By 1868, 1870, it seems that she's starting to enjoy life a little bit. Ulysses S. Grant will award her a $3,000 a year pension, which will eventually be increased, and there's some back pay involved. But her grief will continue. And her grief is a microcosm of the suffering in all the United States, because we can't really grapple with a conflict that saw so many people die. I mean, the number we all grew up with was 600,000. I believe that's been updated. It's more along 800 to 850,000 Americans, both North and South, dying. You have this idea in the Victorian era, how you were supposed to die. In your deathbed, surrounded by loved ones, you say your last words, and then you slip away peacefully. And here you have a war where people were literally shot to pieces, hundreds of miles away from home, never saw their families again, bodies never returned, buried where they fell. And so there's a lot of people who cannot grapple with what they have been through. And Mary Todd kind of takes on that symbolism. And she will meet with William Mumler, who is a, quote, spirit photographer, to have this picture taken. And this was not an example of fraud. This was not the photographer taking a picture of her and saying, oh, look, the ghost of your husband is with you. This was intentionally done because she wanted to now finally be in a picture with her husband, which she could obviously not. And yes, she is seated, and there he is, much taller than her. She wanted this image out there so that it might give comfort to people who also lost a husband or a father or a son. And there's this idea that you may be reunited with them. However, this was misconstrued as, you know, the spiritualists are taking advantage of crazy old Mary Todd. Look at her. She really thinks the ghost of her husband is in this image with her. When in reality, that was never the case. That was never the intention. By the 1870s, and again, mainly after her death, when the spiritualist movement will really take on full force, mainly into the 1890s is when it picks up. A historian here writes it because I think she says it better than I can, so I put the quote here. The nation fought so hard to hold on to Lincoln's ghost because he represented the idea of a spirit coming home and looking over its family from above. During a time when so many families had lost fathers and sons, it was comforting to know that the father of the nation was still looking over them as well. Hearing stories of Lincoln's ghost gave these families hope that their own fallen father figures were also looking over them as well. Moreover, his ghost demonstrated that he and the soldiers who perished in battle were able to find comfort despite the circumstances of their untimely deaths. She returns to Chicago in 1871, where a third son, Tad, will become sick and die shortly after. And this is going to send her into even more eccentric behavior. Her spending habits become more odd. She goes to more psychics, more mediums. The relationship with Robert is going to become even more strained. And in 1875, he will have her tried for lunacy in a very public case. But it's not so cut and dry as people think. He hires private investigators to follow her around, to spy on her, see what stores she's shopping at, what psychics she's going to. He appoints her defense, and he arranges a guilty verdict to the point where the jury deliberated for 10 minutes and found her insane. They didn't even try. They didn't even sit in there for an hour. 10 minutes, they came out. They said she is officially been declared a lunatic, as would be called. And with that, all of her stocks and bonds would be handed over to Robert. And we have the age-old debate, which we now know which one it is, eccentricity versus lunacy. Is she really crazy, or is she just a little odd? We're allowed to be a little odd. We're all weird, right? In our own special way. And while in this private asylum, she's visited by Myra Bradwell, an early women's suffrage figure, who is going to talk with her. And her immediate impression is that she's just, you know, a little odd. And she talks to the nurses and the doctors. And you got to think, how many horror movies from this time, you know, depicting this time period, somebody's in an asylum, you're not getting out. This is, you are guilty until proven innocent. And beyond that, she's been declared a lunatic. There's no way you're getting out back then. But she was seen as somebody who was so normal in their eyes that they knew she was not crazy. And it took some letters written by her to the press. The press is now going to be on her side for the first time in a while, saying, look at this, Mary Todd held against her will. You know, she's really not crazy. They're keeping her there. And the public outrage is going to be so great that they will release her, not just release her, but legally restore her as sane within a year, which is, again, remarkable for the time period that this transpired. She will fight to get control over her bonds from Robert. He says, oh, no, I'm not giving them back to you. And she says, fine, I'm just going to disinherit you from the rest of the family fortune. So, of course, he gives her the stocks and bonds back. She will do everything she can to get away from him, touring Europe for years, where she will return back to the United States in 1880. where she sees her pension increase to $5,000 now with $15,000 in back pay. And all this time fearing poverty, she's never close to it. In 1882, though, she will collapse on the anniversary of Tad's death, and she will die the next day. And it was discovered at her death that she destroyed her will so that Robert would have to fight to get the inheritance, that she knew he would get it as the only, heir that she had. But she just wanted to make it a little difficult for him, as he had made her life difficult by destroying her will. This is her entire obituary that appeared in 1882. Springfield, Illinois, July 16th, Mrs. Lincoln, widow of the late president, died in this city at 8:15 p.m. She had been ill for a long time. A few days ago, she grew worse. Saturday evening, she suffered a stroke of paralysis, and from that time lay in a comatose state until she died. Robert Lincoln left Washington tonight and will be here Tuesday morning. The funeral announcement will be made later. That's it. That's all she got. Now obituaries, they're like forever, especially for a figure like this. She gets a paragraph. And her funeral mass, they had 3 different preachers there, 3 different Christian preachers, different denominations. And Robert Todd actually had the gall to say, wow, Mom would have really loved this service. He actually commented. She would be buried not next to her husband exactly, but in the same vicinity. As a couple of us were talking about before, Abraham Lincoln's remains are now below, I think, 20 feet of concrete because they kept trying to steal his body. And so he is well below the earth. She is up in a tomb off to the side, but they are in the same room. And this is one of the last pictures taken of her. And it's a picture that, this is the image I think we have in our minds about her. Maybe not so much this crowd, but when I do this at other places where people are maybe just more casual, interested in history or learning this stuff for the first time, this is really the picture we have, what stays with us. But I'm going to leave you guys with this nice colorized picture, a little younger, a little more vibrant, and just say that, there's a lot to learn from this. There's a lot of people throughout history that have been or had misconceptions about them. And for us to just not forget the human element of this, that, these were real people. And it's odd to say that because, of course, they were people. But when we read so many books and see so many movies, they kind of get to a level where they're a character. They're not quite real. But she was real. Her grief was real. And her trauma was real. And this is something, thankfully, we know a little bit more about it today. So we may have an easier time. But anyway, thank you guys very much for joining me tonight. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something.
And then on the Zoom, some of the people may have questions.
Sure, if anybody.
Glenn, you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you so much. Would Mary Ann Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln, would they be considered like a power couple? I know they love politics and that type of thing. So is there any evidence that Mary Todd had a tremendous influence on President Lincoln during his 4-year run? Over.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why I'm looking up there. I would consider Mary Todd and Abraham a power couple. I mean, that's a very modern term, but the good thing about, or what we should try to do with history is try to make these people more accessible. And so by calling them a power couple, I would absolutely agree. He is somebody that became a rising star. She is somebody that wanted to be with the rising star. She had the wealth, he had the know-how and the knack for politics, and combined together, they were the ultimate power couple politically.
Thank you.
A good example of how she helped him in politics in the early days when they were still dating. She helped him write some letters to the editor attacking other political opponents of Lincoln. And one was so harsh that the person who it was written about, first off, demanded to know who was the author. And Lincoln stood up and said it was me. And then challenged him to a duel.
Wow.
And basically, they calmed down when Lincoln didn't apologize, but said it was all done for political reasons. It wasn't personal.
Right. Just business, not personal.
Yeah, exactly. But also, I was gonna say, I think Mary Todd always had like this incredible fear of poverty. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when she first got married, here she's coming from a rather wealthy home with, slave servants and things like that. And now she's living in one room at a tavern. And on top of that, Lincoln still was paying off the debt from when he had a grocery store or store in Salem, Illinois. And it was rather substantial. In fact, Lincoln referred to it as the national debt. But I think that added to her fear of poverty coming from such a wealthy position to such a humble one.
Right. Not wanting to go back to that, to just, keep moving forward, try to accumulate as much money as she could. Yeah.
Yeah, one question, on your chart, you show that he only had 1 year of formal education. How was he a lawyer?
Well, it was a little different back then. Yeah. I mean, you could just, if you just grab some law books, if you knew how to read and studied the law, you could say you were a lawyer.
The bar, you would take the.
Take the bar exam.
You would have to work with a lawyer.
Right, you'd apprentice.
He would have to recommend you. You would then sit before 3 judges who would determine whether or not you knew enough about the law.
You didn't have to go to 3 extra year or
Yeah.
7 years.
And then one of the funniest things is if they did approve you, the tradition at the time was the person who just was admitted to the bar had to take the 3 judges who reviewed him out to dinner.
Sounds pretty good. Not a bad deal.
President Cleveland is an example of that.
Jackson, too. William Travis.
And you can see how many politicians who are lawyers today that have so much education, how they differ from these guys that had none at all. And that education is it as important as educators? We'd love to say education is important.
I believe it's still legal for you to become a lawyer in California through that method.
Really?
Yes.
One of the only presidents that had a patent also. Something about the boats. You came up with something.
Yeah.
Only president with a patent.
Anybody else?
I just got to go the fashion route. But that blue dress, just to give you some background, I work in the apparel industry.
Okay.
Let me tell you a little about that dress. First of all, the dress was blue, purple, something like that.
I'll put the picture on the screen while you're talking about it.
And this period of time in the 1860s, we're just beginning to work with chemical dyes. The first chemical dye that came out on the market was after the Civil War, and it started being published. They started being sold like after the Civil War. So this dress in this purple or blue color would have come from an organic material. So if it was purple, it would have come from mussels. And if it was blue, it would have come from indigo. So in order to dye cotton fabric, and I think this is a cotton velvet, which I'm going to talk about velvet in just a minute, the fabric would be dyed with this material, like a slurry made of this material. And then in order to get the color to hold it, we put into something called a mordant, which makes the color hold, which in case of both of those is urine. And that's how the color is held in the garment. Secondly, this is a velvet. And velvets are a special kind of weave. They're like a double loop. And so when it's made, it just looks like a double loop thread going through in one of the directions. And then there was an occupation called a velvet cutter. And the velvet cutters would have a very long knife, and they would walk along and they would go, just think how many threads per inch is there. They would go along and they would cut. And to do a yard of fabric, a person would be walking about 8 miles up and down the table to do that cutting. And so when you look at this, and if I just look at that fabric, knowing what the color is, knowing what the materials, the exotic materials that were used to make the dye, the process to do the dye, and then you add the hours of labor to cut that velvet. It's really an incredible dress.
I'm glad I put that picture in there. That wasn't in this until recently. I was like, you know what, I got something with some pop, and I figure most people probably could care less, but I'm glad
Doesn't
that,
make it
you know.
interesting when you look at it that way.
I'm gonna go out and buy some velvet.
Now it's all done with machines.
Yeah.
You don't have the velvet cutters, but even as late as like the 1920s, when you had the big fabric mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, the people, the immigrants that came there were women who were velvet cutters who actually made more money than their husbands who might have been weavers in those plants.